ahead and kick it off.
Okay, so just as a reminder for everyone, this meeting follows the code of conduct of the Ecma TC54. It's also in the Git repo, and that's one thing. And second, the video is being recorded, and so that's pretty much it. We'll go through first introduction of attendees, and then anyone that wants to bring up specific items to the topic. So, Dustin, you want to go? I think you're muted at this time.
I'm looking for the mute. Sorry, what was the question?
Do you want to do a quick intro?
Yes. So, hey, I'm Dustin. I'm on Google's open source software security team, which broadly works across internal, external things about how Google consumes and uses open source software securely. One of the things that's come up for us is that we're interested. We use Perls in a lot of places. We found some shortcomings. So we're interested in participating in the work group here, and so that's sort of why I'm showing up here.
Great. Yanis.
Hello, I'm Yanis. I work at Apple. I'm broadly involved in many different things, software supply chain security, and then, as Dustin said, we also use Perls and CycloneDX, and the more you use it, the more you wish for certain things to exist or not exist. And my work is mostly on the services side, so not so much on macOS apps or iOS apps, but more the server side.
Great. Do we want to? Yeah, maybe Steve, go ahead. We're going to introduce ourselves. As long as we're a manageable number, I think it's okay to reintroduce everyone. Steve, briefly, go ahead. Oh, you're muted.
Steve Springer, Director of Product Security at ServiceNow, Chair of Ecma TC54 and the CycloneDX Core Working Group, and the OWASP Global Board of Directors.
Okay, Adam.
Hey everyone, I'm Adam. I work professionally at NextB, helping deliver go-to-market strategy for the About Code stack. But I'm also here representing About Code, who leverage Perls extensively. Also, I'm going to be taking notes. If you find any errors in my notes or things you want to correct, feel free to fix them in that Google Doc that Philippe shared earlier. And yeah.
John.
Good morning, good evening, everybody. My name is John Horan. I work at NextB with Philippe and Adam and company as a software analyst and primarily software developer. I encounter Perls daily and am working on some Perl-related apps, including a UI for PerlDB to validate Perls at the moment.
All right, thank you. Thank you all. So, in terms of announcements, I don't have anything special, unless some of you will be in Europe at the Linux Foundation Open Source Summit Europe next week in Vienna, Austria. I'll be there, and I know there's some folks, prior participants to this meeting that will be there, so we'll try to hook up. In terms of any other announcements?
I've got just one briefly. I've been working with Aki Rose, who is on TC39, so JavaScript. They've been, they actually have a really interesting process where they have all the requirements in order to format an ECMA/ISO compatible document without having to rely on Microsoft Word. We ran into a lot of challenges, as you know, Ecma supplied the template for us. Even ISO supplied templates in ISO in Word format. And we ran into a lot of challenges with that. The OpenXML specification is interpreted differently. So our friends using LibreOffice were basically not able to view our documents. We had to produce the PDFs anyway. So I'll be working with Aki. She's really interested in helping us be successful, eliminate Microsoft Word as a intermediary format. So that's the one thing that if you'd like to, in package URL, because of the specification, is going to be much smaller than something like CycloneDX. I think it's a perfect way to do a POC. So I'm going to be doing a POC with Aki using package URL.
Yeah, if we can stay away from all the minutiae of document formatting, that will be much welcome. Agenda items. So I did put a few items on the agenda. First one would be to discuss merging namespace and name in the Perl spec. Another one is there's quite a few ambiguities around support for Golang and the interpretation by different tools and communities. And third, whether we merge or not the verse specification as is. And I have some suggestion there. And any other key issues you think would be really important to bring up before we complete the version 1 of the working standards. So it would be just, we may not be able to go through all these items, but that would be a first pass. Any other agenda items you guys want to bring up? At least for today. Dustin, Yanis, what is your biggest pain with Perl so far?
I have a bit of a list. I think I'm still working on putting it together in a way that I can share with the group. I'm still also going through the issues in the GitHub repository and figuring out what's already been identified. I think for us, one of the pain points is that we found that in some ecosystems, the qualifiers are underspecified or not present, which doesn't reliably allow us to map Perl to a specific artifact. It might map to a collection of artifacts. It's been a challenge, and I sort of recognize the overall challenge there as well, which is that for each individual ecosystem, the number of qualifiers is potentially huge. Like I'm very familiar with the Python ecosystem, and I know how that can explode, you know, across multiple dimensions of OS, platform, CPU architecture, that kind of thing. So I'm aware of like the challenge here of we don't want to just fully bring that specification into the Perl specification, but finding a way to do that is, I think, high on our list. Maybe not the highest thing, but definitely something that's a pain point.
Definitely, that's a very good one. So qualifiers. Yanis, any specific thing you want to bring up, or what's your biggest pain point?
I was just thinking, I don't think I have anything super specific. Just one thing that came to mind, like in the SBOM context, was we want to have Perls for everything, but then there's of course components that are not really packages, like an operating system component or something like this. And yeah, I'm not aware of a good way to like if you put it, or how you put it into a Perl, or if it even belongs into a Perl when a Perl is just really just for packages and not for I don't know, like my Red Hat component or something that an SBOM might contain.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I mean,
and it seems to be hard for people to understand that you have like what we see a lot is that instead of GitHub, many people who put Perls in places, they don't put GitHub there, but the actual GitHub host that they want to use instead of the qualifier. And like this is a very common error where I don't have a solution, but I just see it all over the place.
Okay, so yeah, so that's good point. So there's a couple of things there, not specifically as part of the spec, but I think evolving tools that can cope with common issues, common formatting or syntax issues or under specification can help a bit to fix some of these. And the general topic of things that are not Perl, I mean, let's not be mistaken. The ambition is not for Perl to be like the end solution to identifying everything. I think it's okay to have escape hatches to identify things which are not exactly fitting the model of Perls, like, for instance, using SWID stuff into a Perl. Using generic package URLs to a certain extent makes sense too. But even on generic package URLs, evolving a convention so that, say, let's assume you use upstream glibc, so the GNU libc, which is not specifically a package in any repo, but say upstream. Let's imagine for a second it's not even part of the GNU project. It sits on its own little island on its isolated website. Maybe zlib is a better example. I think we can evolve a convention for these to have structured Perl for generic Perls, which take into account the fact it's on zlib.net. And that becomes then something which becomes easy to resolve and a bit more obvious and natural than, because each time otherwise you have a bit of arbitrary. The difficulty is each time you have something which requires thinking and make a decision, the decision is likely to be made incorrectly. And you were bringing up qualifiers, Dustin. And what do you do, for instance? Say you use a Python package, say LXML. For any release, you literally have 100 to 200 artifacts and one source distribution and 200 wheels. Each of them are technically built from the same source, but in some weird and devilish ways, they may be not exactly the same source origin fully. There may be binaries that have been rendered in some version on Windows that you won't find on Linux and else. So, which, say from an overall origin, are not problematic. There can be serious security issues because you may have a rendered copy that's statically linked of XML2 and libxsl in the Windows version that you don't find in the Linux version, and therefore they may be subject to completely different paths of execution, different vulnerabilities. It's actually a problem that's not even solved, by the way, in most of the vulnerability databases, because they entirely ignore that there's this kind of rendering taking place. But so I don't know what the solution. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, I absolutely agree. Like that's the problem we run into with many of our vulnerability scanners, like in the Python ecosystem and elsewhere. And I think like it's somewhat resolved by using file hashes. You don't always have the hash to refer to though. So yeah, it's definitely a shortcoming for us.
Yeah. So okay, so qualifiers, generic Perls, and the topics I've moved. So let's add this to the agenda. I'm adding that to the document here. Too many tabs. So maybe something I'd like to start is this issue of prioritization. And so how much we want to put in the Perl. So what's the horizon to actually come to a standard that we can submit to the technical committee for approval and review? So what's the horizon, what's the ETA, and how much do we want to put in terms of work to clarify some issues that we have and all the issues we're listing here and more, versus putting a first stake in the ground and do some work either separately on a separate thread. What's your take on that, Steve?
My initial thought is to take a look at the existing markdown of the Perl 1.0 specification.
Okay.
And go through it very, very much in detail and discuss the things that we like, the things that we don't like, the things that we might want to change. You have one of those things already on the list, right? Namespace and name, right? So we might want to start with the existing document. And if we need to bump it to like a version 1.1 type of thing, and then submit that to TC54, right? That would be fine. But I think we first need to flesh out the existing specification.
Okay.
Make any corrections we need to. And that's obviously going to lead to a lot of discussion because, again, namespace versus name. I think you briefly brought up what what qualifiers we should have that are specifically defined in the Perl types versus we want to include more global qualifiers that would apply to all Perl types. I think these are some questions we need to answer.
Yeah. And so, okay, great. Any other one to bring, wants to bring anything on the topic? My plan ideally would be that October, November, December, somewhere around early to mid-January, we've come down to a something we can agree that's good for standardization. So I don't want to be too aggressive. Just be mindful that all the work we're doing here is volunteer work, even if we all have a day job. So I don't want to be too aggressive, but there's a lot of work to cover there. And I think we don't want to have the work actually take place here in these discussions. I'd like to have the work taking place offline, eventually detailed discussion taking place on PRs and issues, and then bringing these for review here and discussion when there's actually a debate or discussion to be had, or just say, hey, that's cool, we're good with that. Because otherwise, I mean, these meetings would be, I mean, it's not it wouldn't be fair to the community if there's just a handful of people there which can participate and review that. So if there's no objection, I think that's going to be the way we will be working there. Okay, so stake in the ground, trying to put an ETA roughly around a mid-January, early to mid-January. Vetting the current 1.1 spec and debating it to make sure we can identify very specifically things. There's a lot of review to do to all the kind of 100-ish issues and PR which are pending. Some of them are great ideas that are probably best left aside. Some of them are must-haves, and some of them are very bad ideas. So the difficulty is how do we sort that out? I'm planning to spend more time, and John is trying to help there too. And Dustin, if you're willing also to go through all these issues, there's a lot of there's a lot of content there. So we could have also separate sessions to do kind of bug ticket reviews, to do triage, on the ones we want to look at seriously, and the other one that are just leave aside. Okay, so discussing namespace and name for a second. That's been one area that's somewhat confusing because some ecosystems and package types like PyPI, there is no namespace. Some others like NPM, JavaScript, sometimes you have a namespace. That's called a scope there. Sometimes you don't. In the case of Maven, you always have one namespace, which is the group ID. But so it becomes a bit arbitrary if you have namespace that exists sometimes and a name alone the other time, to consider that as two different things. And the idea there is just to simplify and to say we have a name which is just structured with as many slash separators as you want. And there's conventions in for a package type where there's a specific meaning to that. So the first segment is the group ID for Maven, and it would be fully backward compatible with the current usage. It's just that namespace would not be a specific thing of its own. So I don't know if you guys react to that in any way, shape, or form. We'll have to put that. I think there's already some issues, but I wanted to bring it up here.
My
yeah.
first reaction, I guess, is I actually like the separation. I like that you're giving a specific meaning to something, even if certain repositories don't utilize that concept. I think we also need to keep in mind the possibility that if other ecosystems start implementing a namespace, that there's the potential that the allowed characters and that sort of thing, capitalization, could in fact be different between the namespace and the name of something. Now, I don't think that's an issue today, but it theoretically could be in the future.
Okay. And Dustin's just pasting a...
Yeah.
Are you saying, so PEP 572? Aha.
Yeah, so the Python ecosystem's working on adopting some form of namespacing. I don't think it's been determined what it'll be like. My question or my thought here is that, I think, not that I've reviewed every single ecosystem and the way they do namespacing. I've seen many,
Yeah.
and I get the feeling that for those ecosystems, it's not uncommon to have a way to combine a namespace and a package name into a single string, and they have a standard for doing that, right? Like,
yeah.
And I think that's what would happen for Python too. And so I don't see, as long as there's a standard way to do that, there might not be a good reason to have two separate fields.
I see more problems with these than I see values in the end. And I was the one that introduced that from the very beginning. So we can debate that offline, but I'll make sure we have a thread on this topic. It becomes even more interesting if you look at the next topic, which is Golang. So let me explain a bit what the problem with Go Perl is. In Go, a package is a path, which has an arbitrary number of segments. And eventually, vulnerabilities are tracked at that level of granularity. There's another concept which is called the module. And to simplify, a Git repo hosts a Go module with many packages. So the notion of package in the context of Go is a bit different than, it's probably more related to the notion of a package in Java. which is basically a path in a file tree. The difficulty is there's no way to determine when a module stops and a package starts. The module string, say github.com/foo/bar, is the prefix to the package path and is used as the first segment, but there's no way to know when it starts and when it ends. It's the only tools that know about that are the Go toolchain. And the way they resolve this is actually by, in some case, just doing a lookup on the Go proxy and trying to figure out, in some case, even by trial and errors, where is the break of my module and when is the start of my package. It's easy when things are on GitHub because everything starts with github.com /foo/bar, but everywhere else, it's a problem.
So
As a result,
I
like-
actually
Yeah, go
see
ahead.
this a little bit different. You know, I don't think this issue is specific to Golang. I mean, Java, you have the concept of Uber jars, and how we handle Uber jars in Java is to have an SBOM that says, well, this thing includes these other things.
Mhm.
And those other things are in fact the packages. Now, if we go down that road with package URL, we are essentially saying, well, now we want package URL to do a contains. And if we do that, that's would be basically applicable to every ecosystem, not just Golang. So you're stepping on the boundary of, I think, of what SBOM, in my opinion, is actually used for.
Actually, no. So we'll need to take the discussion in details on an issue because it's not entirely straightforward. But the point is, what Go calls a package is really just a subdirectory in what we would think of a package in Perl. What you would think naturally as being a package in Perl would be what's called a Go module, which contains one or more Go files in a file tree, and is marked by the fact that there's a Go mod file in that directory. The problem is that when I scan Go code, so in source code, I'll find the Go mod. That's okay. So I know where the module breaks and the package inside that modules continue. In a binary, I have no way to find out. I have a bunch of paths. I don't know what is the breaking point in the middle. So that's really not, we're not talking about multiple origins and SBOM. We're talking about a single origins and the fact there's multiple paths inside. The point is, again, vulnerabilities are being reported at that level. And so there's been two approaches that have been taken by different tools. Technically, the spec for Perl says, more or less, it's ambiguous, but more or less says, you should put the Go module, so Golang, so pkg Golang / whatever your Go module in, which in many cases is going to be github.com/foo/bar. And then the path inside this Go module would be subpath. So at the end of your Perl, you put a pound and the path inside. The alternative is to put everything in the subpath inside the namespace name segment. And that's really the alternative we're discussing here, because the difficulty is that it's practically impossible to observe Go code and say, this is the module, this is the package reliably. And as a result, I see in the wild folks using one or the other. The problem is that when you want to do a lookup in the Vaulty database, if you have one or the other, you won't get the right hit. So my inclination would be to relax this specifically for Go and just embrace the ways of this community which is to deal with more fine-grained packages, because we cannot determine modules reliably. It'd be interesting, Dustin, if there's folks on the Go side at Google that can chime in. That would be awesome. But we can also ask them on issues and tickets on this very specific topic. In the past, Russ Cox and other folks from Go have very gently chimed in on Perl-related issues.
Yeah, I'm happy to raise the visibility of any Go-related issue if
Yeah.
you want to get some acronym.
Yeah.
That brings up an
So-
interesting point, though. We might, as a future backlog item, we might want to discuss compatibility and Perl type versioning. If we introduce a change that is technically backward compatible or not backward compatible at some point in time, what do we do? I don't know.
Yeah. I like for this domain, and that make you cringe, I'm sure. I like that. That's the URL spec approach, which is not standardized with ISO or Ecma or else, but is designed to be a living standard. The problem is that if you have versioning, you need to eventually make the version part of the string here.
Right.
And very quickly that overloads the stuff. We need to evolve the conventions and solidify them for each ecosystem as we go. And I think if we include in the specification of a package type whatever historical quirk exists and alternative ways to interpret the spec existed in the past, so the tools implementer can do whatever fixing they can do, I think that probably would be easier. Because very quickly, if you start having versions, yeah. So I'm not too much in favor. I don't know if others, what's the take of others on the topic, but I'm fine with versioning, say, the spec. But I don't think we need to version the spec for each file type, each package type. And I don't even think we should put the version of the spec in the Perl itself, Perl string. But your mileage may vary. Yanis, Adam, John, Dustin, you have any idea on the topic?
I just have feelings, and the feeling is a little bit also when it's so ambiguous to, does the namespace contain /it, does it not? And then you invite errors in the parsing, and in the end, it's that kind of string that identifies the thing that you're talking about, which for me then is namespace and name. And then if you have the subpath, that is interesting, but for many use cases that I think about, it's the name of the thing, so namespace and name. And I don't often care, I think, about knowing what part is the namespace and what part is the name. But it's just a feeling. So I'd have to think about it for a moment.
Yeah, okay. All right. Moving on next topic, unless you want to bring up more on this one. The version range specification. So it's been pending for merging forever. If you're not familiar with that, let me paste the link there. It's a pull request. There's a long list of commands there. The reason I didn't want it to merge it too quickly early on is that I wanted to make sure we could have a good shake at using it in practice with an implementation and have a working implementation of the code that can parse this mini syntax for version ranges. If you're not familiar with the idea, You have version range constraints that are used in package manifests. For instance, in PyPI, you can say, I want to use LXML superior to version 3.9, but I don't want version 3.10, which I know is buggy, and it has to be under version 5. And most ecosystems and package type have their own conventions and mini syntax to document these. The goal of this mini spec is to say the interpretation of the range maybe or how to compare to version is specific to a package type and ecosystem, but we can have a common mini syntax, which is a minimal subset of all that can describe this range efficiently. In some cases, some ecosystems, some package type like Golang, there's no such thing as a version range, but it's implied. All the Go modules specify a minimal version as opposed to a version range, but it's the same. And so the question here is that there's several valid feedback and suggestion for evolution. And I'm still willing to merge these very quickly. Well, very quickly, it's been a couple of years, so it's not quick. But to merge this and then take into account in a separate PR the set of feedback we got as additions. One example, there's suggestion to have a new generic versioning scheme, which would be called in-dot, which would be for versions that are expressed just as numbers with dots, which is a common thing we see in some environment, and a few more things like that. There's already an implementation in Java, so we have two implementations now, one in Python, one in Java. The code that's underlying the Python implementation, a lot of the code for version comparison is actually used also in actually Google's OSV. So I think there's enough. It's part of the CycloneDX spec. So I'm inclined, unless there's objections, and I'll make sure I'll collect feedback on the PR one more round. But I'm inclined to go merge this as it is, and start a new PR to take into account all the important suggestions that were part of the specs that were left on the side so far. Doesn't mean calling it a 1.0 whatsoever, just making sure we have a stable merge version, and then we have further work that can go on a separate thread with a bit less busy busy PR, because it's a long one with a lot of comments. So it's a bit hard to swallow for anyone to read.
Yeah, maybe I'm missing context. I just saw it for the first time now. But this is about just how to express it in a string, and then
Yes.
how to compare the versions, actually, whether it's a semantic one or some funky big corp inside. We have been naming things like this forever, and this is what the parts mean. Kind of comparison, that's all up to the implementation. This is just like how in a string can we express a range of versions that are arbitrary, that can be anything, and we would have to escape certain characters? Or is it, in this case, like the versions can only be, I don't know, numbers, dashes, and periods, or something like this?
So the core of the spec is to say the version strings are arbitrary. And what we specify is the set of operators that are used for comparing version to express a range. So that it can be used to simply express an enumeration of versions, which is the simplest form of a range, down to more complex things like, superior to this version, not this version, inferior to this version. That's the ambition of the spec, and then using a prefix like a package type, but which is there here for the package version, for the versioning scheme, have a certain number of well-known specs like semver, which can then be just referenced for the implementation. As it happens, when we created a small library called Universe, which implements the spec, and when you start to use it at scale on many packages, you realize that semver is a lie, because nobody really uses semver. I think it's actually on your side of the house, Dustin. The only serious versioning spec I've ever seen is the one used by Google's Play Store. And each time you upload an app, it starts version 1. It doesn't care about your version. The next upload will be version 2, and the next one 3, and so on and so on. And they just completely ignore the string you provide as version, which is just there as a decoration and label for the show. I'm pretty sure there's something similar in
Well, that ecosystem has the huge advantage where there doesn't need to be compatibility between multiple things. So yeah, it works.
But so Yanis, that's the intent of the spec, and what it's used for is that you can then store this information in database and more reliably deal with not only the range and constraints you have between when you have a package manifest, but also when you have vulnerable version ranges. If you ever seen for instance, the CP spec and the way the National Vulnerability Database deal with specifying version ranges, it has a whole special way. So it's a way to be able to simplify the notation. So we have a common notation across the board. Also to, if possible, promote, because the specs exist, avoiding an inflation of weird syntaxes that we see popping up left and right. There's something in NuGet called floating versions. And when you use a star in a version somewhere in a NuGet package, dependency constraints, it means something different and change the way dependency resolution is done, which is completely weird. It's very uncommon. So we want to promote the adoption of simpler syntax, and in any case, being able to resolve all these weird syntax to something that's easier to deal with. The purpose is when you have database that store package information and package versions, and vulnerable package range is to simplify how you resolve this. Otherwise, everybody's going to use their own convention. And that's what you see happening across different vulnerability databases today. GitLab, GitHub, Sneak, Sonatype, each in their own right use their own convention. It's not helpful for the consumer downstream.
Yeah, makes total sense to me. I think also my colleague Mike Heppel, who's also in this group, or at least he joined with me, and I think he was tinkering with this also. So I'm gonna send him the notes, because we totally also have that problem.
Yeah. And so the interesting things you can do after that with this is that once you've normalized the notation for a version range, it doesn't matter to have a common way to interpret them across ecosystems, because the way versions are going to be resolved and handled in Maven are different from the way they're done in PyPI and elsewhere. So it's more in the confine of an ecosystem, and being able to have a unified notation across ecosystems. But once you have that in an ecosystem, what you can do is you can also combine functional constraints. So say, I don't use version 5 of LXML because it's buggy, but any version above 5 is good. With vulnerability information, like I know 5.1 is subject to CV 123. Therefore, it becomes also something you can subtract from the version range or the resolution process to go and use not only the versions you need and know work from an operational point of view and functional point of view, and the versions you want to avoid because they're known to be either buggy or vulnerable or for whatever other constraint you may apply. So that's the general purpose there.
I like your proposal. I like your proposal. The PR as it currently stands is really hard to follow. It's been that way for a long time. I think merging it in and then picking the important things to flesh out in a separate PR, I think is a smart thing to do.
Okay.
Yeah.
And some folks will cringe, some folks will be happy about that. I know folks from GitHub have been breathing down my neck for several months saying, when do you merge that stuff? When do you merge that stuff? So they'll be happy. Some folks may cringe, says, why didn't you add my stuff? But, you know, you cannot please everyone. So
I would make it a point to say that this is still a snapshot, though. This is not a 1.0 thing.
Exactly. Yeah, I'll make sure I'll make that point.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've discussed a bit already qualifiers, ambiguities, but there's probably more than that. So the question is whether you want to. So I don't know how you want to handle that, Dustin. We can have a single overarching issue, or we deal with this on a package type by package type basis.
Yeah, I think there's probably two things. One is like our philosophy on how Perl should work across ecosystems in this way, and then maybe depending on the outcome there, what the changes to individual ecosystem Perls would be.
Yeah, there's one I guess one contentious point or misunderstanding at time is that the question is Perl resolving to a single unique downloadable package? Or is it resolving to a family of downloads, say like all the different wheels and source distribution of a Python package, or in the case of an RPM, say all the architectures that you may have as built for an RPM. And eventually that boils down to where do we put qualifiers, and we need to always put qualifiers. I've seen scanning tools, open source scanning tools, put systematically a classifier of jar for base Maven jars, where in the spec it's set to be optional, and because that's the default. But that's the kind of things we need to clarify, I think, for each package type. I'm fine as a way. I think it's going to be difficult to say systematically we point to only one download, one specific set of source or binaries. But I think it's a good thing to work towards. And taking again the example, so a use case and the example of LXML, I'm going to have hundreds of wheels. A couple of these have been rendered with audit wheel and may have extra binaries bundled, which are completely unrelated to the source of LXML proper. And so the question is, if I want to identify these wheels specifically, or this other jar, or this specific type of artifact, I should be able to do that because there may be different vulnerabilities there. I guess that's really the key point to me. I don't see any vulnerability database going to that level of detail anyway, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be there. And okay, so with all that said, let's work towards making this a priority, because it's going to be making things much clearer for many ones. I'm fine with having specific qualifiers available or made available, described, specified for sure. The question is going to be always, can I observe the code and determine the qualifier? Because the problem is each time we cannot observe the part of the Perl by just looking at the code, then we're creating a disservice to the community, because they won't be able to figure it out. I mean, and if you're not able to figure out, the spec is a bit useless. Going back to this issue of go package path inside the module, if you cannot figure it out, then you end up having very different ways to look at it. So to me, that's in terms of principles. So I think it would be a good principle to say we're trying as much as possible to point to a specific download and artifact, as long as just by observing the code, you can infer everything you want from a Perl. In the vast majority of the case, there'll be cases where it's not possible. If I see just zlib.123.rgz, I don't know where the stuff is coming from. It's not from a package. There's no metadata. So everything that's generic and off Broadway will always be a bit more difficult, but that's okay. But at least I want to make sure that for the common case, things stay simple and straightforward and obvious. Obvious, probably the best word there. Yanis, you were about to say something?
No, I was just wondering about, and I thought I would say something, but then I didn't, about like the different kind of use cases or places where I would see a Perl, and where in the SBOM, maybe you just want the whole package and you want to say this package is in that artifact, versus for a vulnerability, maybe you want to express it's not just that package, but it's that file in that package. So I was thinking of there's these different kind of situations where you use a Perl, which made me unable to say, yeah, I would always want to have the exact path in there, or I wouldn't. So I was going back and forth in my head a bit.
Well, yeah, the difficulty is how you don't want to overload the Perl too much, because you could have a qualifier that's a Perl with a download URL, with a Perl, with a checksum, and now all of a sudden you have something which is 3,000 characters, and it missed the point when it reached that size. In the case of a vulnerability that's specific to one file in a package, then you can use a subpath.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Then I misunderstood. I thought that's what we're talking about, whether the subpath should always be there. And I was thinking in some situations I can imagine it makes sense, and in others I wouldn't have it. Then I misunderstood.
No. We're talking about qualifiers, not subpath.
Oh,
I think
okay.
subpath is going to always be something that's optional. If we have evolving case where we have vulnerability database and we can precisely pinpoint which file is related to a vulnerability, and if there's only one, then we can effectively use subpath in the vulnerability database to make sure you point specifically to a file. But even then, the query of this database should be first with subpath. Say for Perl 1, I'm going to query with subpath, and then without subpath in all cases, because you don't know whether you'll have a super specific vulnerability. And the same applies in many cases to qualifiers. You may have vulnerabilities that apply only specifically to a combination of qualifiers, but if there's also vulnerability that's generic, you're going to have to query both with and without qualifiers, I guess. So we'll put
Yeah.
all that in tickets and issues to make sure we can document the discussion and all the different moving parts there. Okay, and you brought up last, Yanis, and then we'll be done in a minute, the difficulties to handle generic burls and non-packaged code. So there's a type called SWID,
Yeah.
which is another specification, which is to reuse and hijack the SWID identifiers, and Steve also created a tool to generate some example there that we can refine. But the idea would be to say, for things that are not public, that are not packaged, the only thing we can have is a way to generate mostly unique package URLs.
Yeah, for these things, I was just curious, what like do people just stuff SWIDs in there? But I also have other curiosities that are not so like spec related, but more like usage related, maybe like how often is the Perl actually content addressing something, or how often is it just loosely addressing and you can't really check and so on? But those are more anecdotes.
That's actually no. That's actually a good point to bring. Also, we can track these in issues and make sure we address that in the spec. That's part of the same problem. I wish it were always content addressable. That's the short answer. The reality is that it's content addressable most of the times.
Yeah.
And we would want to find ways that the case where it's not content addressable doesn't take an inordinate amount of time to find a good identifier. The problem is, in the end, say there's a piece of proprietary non-public software you want to have an identifier for that, but it's not public, so nobody else will know how to identify it. And it's a bit like the problem with CPEs, where technically there's no CPE until there's a vulnerability. So you cannot even have a CPE for a package and a product that doesn't exist as a vulnerable item yet. So.
Got it. Sorry, I took us over time.
All right. So I think that's it. Unless there's anyone that wants to bring something else to the discussion. We're mostly on time, which is wonderful. John, Yanis, Steve, Adam, anything you want to bring up?
Nothing from me, Philippe. Thank you.
Meeting will be up on YouTube later today.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a wonderful day, night, evening, morning, and weekend. Bye now.
Happy weekend. Bye.
Bye.